A Journal for Jordan was written by, and let me give a shout out to the writers here, because if I don't give a shout out to the writers here on the Spun Today podcast, who will? A Journal for Jordan was written by Virgil Williams. He wrote the screenplay, and it's based on the book by Dana Kennedy, which is based on the personal journal of Charles Monroe King, because this movie is based on a true story. And Charles Monroe King is played by none other than Michael B. Jordan. My guy has come a long way since Wallace. Am I right? And the cherry on top, it's directed by none other than Denzel Washington. What a dope combination. And here is the official synopsis. First Sergeant Charles Monroe King, before he was killed in action in Baghdad, authors a journal for his son, intended to tell him how to live a decent life despite growing up without a father. Hence the title, A Journal for Jordan. Jordan is his son. Let me tell you a little bit about Dana Kennedy. She's an American journalist that worked at the New York Times for over 20 years. In 2001, she won a Pulitzer Prize for co-authoring a series called How Races Lived in America. Her segment in that series that won the Pulitzer Prize was called The Hurt Between the Lines, a newsroom divides after a healing series on race, which focused on the similar yet divergent paths of two award-winning columnists, one which was white and one which was black, from the Akron Beacon Journal. She then wrote the memoir, A Journal for Jordan, a story of love and honor, back in 2008. And this grew out of an essay that she wrote for the New York Times about the death of her fiance, United States Army First Sergeant Charles Monroe King, which died in the Iraq War. Her husband in the movie is played by Michael B. Jordan. And the way they depicted in the movie is that she came from this military family. Her father was in the military, and Michael B. Jordan came up under her father and really respected her father a lot. And her father, by the way, was played by Robert Wisdom, and his character's name is Sergeant T.J. Kennedy. But Robert Wisdom, better known as Howard Bunny Colvin, or Major Bunny Colvin from The Wire. So you got Bunny Colvin and Wallace reuniting for this beautiful piece of work. And Dana grows up in this military family. You know, she's very independent. Her family's from the Midwest. She moves to New York. Her father knows that she's like very driven and strong-minded. And he kind of sort of makes it so that Charles Monroe King and her meet at this like family function get together. And they actually do wind up hitting it off. And long story short, they start a relationship. And throughout the movie, she's like somewhat reluctantly easing into this relationship. And there's like this instant connection between the two. You're definitely rooting for them. And you're also kind of, or at least I was skeptical at first about Michael B. Jordan's character, because he was kind of like too good to be true-ish, if that makes any sense. Like from her perspective, he was like a good man, seemed like a family man, but he did have some like baby mama drama, kind of, because he had a kid with another woman that he's no longer with. But he seemed like uber respectful and always said the right thing, didn't seem to have like faults. So she was understandably like guarded towards him. He was nice and respectful to like all her friends, everybody liked him basically. And they make that case in point, I believe, with the door guy in her building, the building that she lives in New York. When he comes to visit, he becomes friendly with the doorman, you know, because he's coming and going so much. And he gives the doorman he brings the doorman a Mets hat one day, just because he had mentioned that, you know, he's a Mets fan. And he was just like that kind of dude, you know. He was very much so about his business, though. And by his business, I mean war. Playing his position within the structure of the military that he was in. And he was even in that, he was like the quintessential soldier, led by example, never asked his men to do anything that he wouldn't do, was on the front lines, even though he was in charge of like a full platoon, I believe is the correct terminology, but don't kill me because I could be off. To the point that actually to a fault, you could say, because he missed the birth of his son because he chose to stay in battle because his men were still on the battlefield, even though he could have gotten the reprieve to, be there with his wife and kid when he was born. So in my eyes, that's a fault, but we all make choices, right? I also can't pretend to even think that I understand the level of camaraderie that comes from sharing a battlefield with someone, especially if you're in charge of those someones and you're sending them out to battle. But the movie was shot in an interesting way because it's a lot of flashback scenes. So you see Dana Kennedy's character, played by Shantae Adams, speaking with her son Jordan, played by Jalen Christian, and him asking questions about his father and her telling him stories. And then while telling those stories, it flashes back to, the point in time of that story. So you find out how they met, and then it flashes to the future where, it shows her like alone without him, but she has a kid from him. Then it flashes back again, and you see some more stories of, like them dating and, progressing in their relationship. Then it flashes forward again. And each time that it flashes forward and flashes back, it's like you're getting like a bookend of the story. Like, he's around at one point, and then at one point he's not around, and he's in the army, and you expect that since it's called a journal for Jordan, that, he dies or something tragic happens. And each time it flashes back and forth, it's like the walls of each side of those flashbacks are like closing in on what inevitably happened to Charles King. And in the story, she's the one that gives him the journal. And she says, while you're overseas and you're thinking about your son, write to him and, just tell him what kind of man you are, what you think about things, what kind of man you want him to be. And this is, needless to say, one of the treasured possessions of the son of Jordan. And it's riddled with life lessons and perspectives from his father, which he obviously doesn't have around anymore. It's a beautiful story though. Beautiful tragedy, as they say. Definitely made me want to bust out a couple journals for my boys. But thankfully, if they can bear listening to my voice, they'll have at least a few hundred hours of my meanderings and perspectives and ideas and shit to listen to here on this podcast. All part of the plan, right? But yeah, Dana Kennedy's character had these really great friends. It's another takeaway I had from the movie. In Miriam, played by Susan Porfar, and Ciro, not sure how to pronounce that, played by Gray Henson. And Charles King actually had prearranged with them and with the army that if something happened to him, if he died, that they would be notified first, her two closest friends, so that they can be there when the news was broken to her. And spoiler alert, that's what happened. They walk in one day into the apartment, and she's like, what are you guys doing here? Then the phone rings, and she's like, hold on a second. They have these somber looks on their eyes, and she gets the news on the phone that Charles King and his men were driving in Iraq, and one of the cars either in front of him or behind him, one of the Humvees were blown up, and the car he was in, I believe, flipped over. And he comes out, and they were ambushed, basically being shot at, and he was shot. And while he lay there on the floor dying, and one of the other soldiers were trying to help him and revive him, telling him to stay awake, he just reached into his pocket where he had a picture of his wife and kid, and just stared at them until he drifted away into death. And Dana's getting this news on the phone while our friends are there. Again, for that purpose, to be there when she gets this bad news and, kind of be her shoulders to cry on. And then in the movie, as the son, Jordan, he's, more grown up now. He's like a young teenager and constantly, inquiring about his dad and asking questions and reading different passages in the journal and asking his mom to fill in some blanks and stuff and asking about the backstory to certain things that his father had written. They take this trip to Arlington National Cemetery where deceased soldiers are buried, which, by the way, was something that was not factual from the movie. The family actually opted to have Charles King buried elsewhere, I believe closer to the family. But they, obviously took creative license with that and showed him at Arlington National Cemetery, because it is, again, known for being the final resting place of deceased soldiers here in the U.S. in Washington. And the son, wanted to take this trip to see where his dad is buried. And that's like the arc of the story, right? Like the mother's going back and telling him all these stories while they're like preparing for this trip. And unbeknownst to the mother, the son had reached out to all these different people that Charles King, his father, whose lives he touched. There were a couple soldiers whose lives he saved by giving up his own. His grandparents were there, like the parents of Dana Kennedy, her friends, Manny, the door guy, who is still rocking, by the way, the now dusty and older Mets cap. And the son joined them there so that they can all visit together, and ended it by reading a short passage from his father's journal, which I won't spoil for you guys because I want you to check out the movie. A Journal for Jordan, available now on Starz. And I believe you can also watch it on Amazon Prime. And I'm sure eventually it'll make its way through the gamut like a lot of movies usually do, and wind up on HBO and then on Netflix and then here and there. You can always download it. But either way, definitely watch it. Highly recommend. A Journal for Jordan. Check it out.